The sun was sinking low over the Iowa plains the evening Johnny Dawson brought the herd home. Dust rose in great red-gold columns behind 1,000 hooves, and Johnny rode at the edge of it all, quiet, straight-backed, hat pulled low against the last of the light. He was 26 years old and looked older, in the way that men who carry responsibility early always do. His crew respected him without being told to. That was the kind of man he was. The drive had gone well. They crossed into Spearhead, South Dakota, just ahead of schedule, and the buyer paid fair money without argument. Johnny counted the bills twice, tucked them into his coat, and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has done what he said he would do. It was a simple pleasure, but it was his. That night, around the campfire, one of his hands started in on the usual ribbing. A man Johnny's age, making this kind of money, still riding the drives alone, didn't he think it was time to find a wife? The crew laughed. Johnny smiled once, the way he always did when a thing was true and he didn't intend to argue with it. He stared into the fire for a long time after that. And in the flames, without meaning to, he saw Willa Hartley. He had been seeing her there in one form or another for the better part of 10 years. He made up his mind on the ride home. He would tell her, simple as that. He had waited long enough, and a man who waited too long for the right moment usually found out there wasn't one. He rode into Elkhart on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day when the air tasted like dust and sunlight. The prairie wind followed him in, carrying the smell of rain that hadn't come yet, stirring the dry grasses into small whirlwinds around his horse's hooves. The ranch spread out before him, wide-shouldered, familiar, worn in all the best ways. Cat was waiting at the edge of the property, arms crossed on the top rail of the fence, one boot heel hooked on the lower plank. That alone was strange. Cat Dawson was not the waiting kind. She had their father's black hair, wild when she forgot to tie it back, and their mother's stubborn jaw. Her eyes were the color of winter violets, and Johnny sometimes thought they could see right through to the truth of things. She was 23 now, and already ran the place with the cool precision of someone who understood how fragile stability could be. Half the men who came to help during cattle season listened to her before they ever looked Johnny's way. He didn't mind. That's how he knew the place was in good hands. She smiled when she saw him, but the smile didn't travel all the way up to her eyes. "You look half-starved," she said. "You look like you've been worrying too much," he replied, sliding down off his horse. They walked toward the house together, talking about feed prices, the south pasture regrowth, the new roof that finally kept the rain out. At supper, the smell of roasted vegetables and fresh baked bread filled the room. And for a while things almost felt simple again. The comfortable rhythm of two people who'd built something and managed to keep it from crumbling. Cat talked with that quiet surety she'd inherited from their mother. The ranch was solid, the herd healthy. She mentioned neighbors, storms, small pieces of news that made up the world around them. And Johnny listened, nodded, smiled in the right places. He felt the weight slide off his shoulders, if only a little. Then, halfway through her sentence about the north fence line, Cat set down her fork. The small sound seemed to echo too loudly in the stillness that settled between them. "Johnny," she said softly. "Willa Hartley's gone." He lifted his eyes. For a moment, nothing moved. Cat went on, not quickly, but evenly, the way she always did when something needed saying plain. Willa's mother had left her a tangle of debts and a lonely patch of dry ground on the edge of town. Wade Hayes, whose money stretched long and whose conscience never had been circling that land like a buzzard. He'd made her life smaller, piece by piece, with cruel smiles and quiet pressure. Finally, Willa had answered an advertisement. A wealthy rancher out of Austin needed a wife. The arrangement was already made. She'd be leaving by the end of the week. Johnny didn't speak. His hand tightened around his fork until the knuckles turned white. Cat watched him closely. She didn't have much of a choice, she said. He set the fork down carefully on the table. His eyes stayed on the plate for a long moment, as though if he didn't look up the words would somehow unhappen. When he finally moved, he stood slow, chair scraping the floorboards. "I see," he said quietly. He carried his plate to the sink, rinsed it out as though nothing were unusual about the motion, then stepped out into the night. Kat stayed where she was. She knew better than to follow. From the kitchen window, she could hear the subtle sounds. The shuffle of boots on dirt, the deliberate rhythm of a saddle being strapped down, the metallic click of buckles meeting leather. The moonlight flashed briefly on steel as he checked his revolver, then dimmed again when he pulled the brim of his hat low. She didn't move to stop him. She had told him because she had to, because truth held its own mercy, even when it sent a person riding off into the dark. Some things you told a man not to keep him still, but to give him reason to move. Johnny mounted up, the horse shifting under him, muscles quivering with anticipation. He looked once back at the warm light spilling from the kitchen window, then turned south. His voice rose only once in the stillness. A low word meant more for himself than for anyone else. "Nobody takes what I love." And then he was gone, one figure against a horizon fading into starlight, the rhythm of hooves carrying him farther and faster than reason or rest could reach. He rode through the night and didn't stop. Past fields that trembled with the whisper of crickets, through towns still dreaming, past lonely telegraph poles standing like sentinels along the road. The moon dropped, then the dawn climbed up again. But Johnny didn't slow until the land around him began to change, and he could feel the weight of distance between what he'd left and what he was going toward. He was a long way from home, and he had no map worth trusting, only the kind of certainty that burns behind a man's ribs when what's ahead is the one thing he can't let slip away. He rode hard through 2 states, stopping only when the horse demanded it. By the time he reached the Texas border, both man and animal were streaked with dust and sweat and persevering on sheer will. The plains gave way to a landscape that shifted under the sun, wider, drier, harsh in its beauty, the kind of country that hardened a man if he stayed long enough. He arrived in Austin with the night fading and the first warmth of early morning lighting the rooftops. The city had a pulse to it, wagons lining the streets, vendors shouting, a train whistle breaking through the air like something sharp. Johnny Dawson looked out over all of it as if he could will her name into appearing somewhere in that crowd. He didn't need long to find which depot she'd be at. He'd asked the right people in the right tone, and when that failed, he'd listened, because people always talked when they thought nobody was paying attention. By the time the clock tower struck 9, he was standing on the platform. His coat was heavy with dust, his hat pulled low, eyes narrowed against the rising sun. He stood tall but quiet, as if the world had gone still and was waiting for what he meant to do next. He had an hour to spare. It felt like the longest hour of his life. Every whistle echo, every creak of the rails, every passing face stretched the minutes thin. He thought about what he'd say, then gave it up. Words never seemed right when they mattered most. He'd simply tell her the truth. That was all he had left. When the train pulled in, the hissing steam turned the whole platform into a cloud. The noise and motion felt almost unreal after days of solitude and thinking. People poured out in a rush, men in long coats, women clutching travel bags, children yawning awake. Then the crowd thinned and he saw her. Willa Hartley stepped down from the car, one hand holding her hat against the breeze. Her dress was pale, travel-creased, but her posture was still proud, the way it had always been. Her hair caught the light in copper waves. The sight of her hit Johnny hard enough to steal his breath. 10 years of distance collapsed in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She saw him at the same moment, froze so quickly that the woman behind her stumbled. "Johnny," she said, voice startled. "What on earth are you doing here?" He crossed the platform in 7 strides, boots striking the boards with deliberate weight. When he stopped in front of her, there was a flicker of disbelief in her eyes, as if she wasn't entirely sure he was real. "I came to stop you," he said. His voice carried, low but certain, cutting through the noise, "from making the biggest mistake of your life." Behind her stood the man she'd come to meet, the rancher. He was older, broad in the shoulders but soft at the middle, dressed too fine for the dust that clung to this place. Money had settled on him like armor, thick and dull. His expression soured when he saw Johnny. "This matter's already settled," the man said, his tone clipped, meant to remind everyone he was used to being obeyed. "Miss Hartley and I have an agreement." Johnny didn't so much as glance his way. His eyes stayed on Willa, steady, unflinching. "I've been in love with you since I was 16, he said, the words roughened by distance and dust but clear enough for the whole platform to hear. "I came to take you home. And to marry you myself if you'll have me." The air thickened. Even the whistle tender froze halfway down the line. Noise bled out of the world. People stopped pretending not to listen. Willa looked at him for a long moment. The years hung between them, all the times they hadn't said what they meant, all the looks that had carried what they never voiced. His coat was caked in road dust, his face lined with exhaustion, but beneath it all was the same steadiness, the same honesty she'd known since they were kids at the summer rodeo. The emotion that rose in her face was quiet but unmistakable. She crossed the space between them and walked straight into his arms. The sound that left him was soft, something halfway between a sigh and a prayer. He held her close, fiercely, as though anchoring both of them in place after too long drifting. The rancher's face turned an ugly shade of red. He wasn't a man used to losing, certainly not in public. "You'll regret interfering," he snapped, hand moving toward his hip. Johnny didn't wait. The moment the metal flashed, his reflex answered. One shot split the morning open like thunder. The platform erupted, screams, motion, boots hammering wood planks as people fled for cover. Willa didn't move. She pressed in against him, her hand tight on his coat as the echo faded away. The smell of smoke drifted between them. The rancher fell backward, his gun still half drawn, shock frozen across his features. When the dust settled, the silence that followed was heavier than the sound before it. Johnny stood in the midst of it, Willa's hand in his, and felt the weight of what had just happened wrap around him like smoke. He didn't regret it, not for a heartbeat. He'd never been a man to draw first, but he'd also never been a man to stand still while someone aimed at what he loved. The sun climbed higher as the sheriff's whistle blew in the distance, but Johnny didn't move. He just lifted Willa's chin so she had to look at him. "It's all right now," he said, voice quiet and rough. "You're safe." And though the law and trouble would come fast, for that one suspended moment, she believed him entirely. The trouble came quickly, as it always does when a rich man dies. In a town like Austin, money traveled faster than truth, and rumors were even quicker. Within the hour, half of Congress Avenue buzzed with talk of the shooting at the depot. Some versions had Johnny Dawson standing wild-eyed in the smoke. Others had Willa Hartley fainting clean away into his arms. By nightfall, there were already 3 different stories, and a dozen men willing to swear they'd seen one of them. Blackwood's associates, those who had drunk with him, borrowed from him, or owed him favors, set about shaping the narrative to their liking. They spoke of a violent drifter come down from Iowa, a man with a gun and something to prove. They murmured that the woman at his side had a past, that she was the sort of girl who courted trouble and got what she bargained for. And they pressed heavy coins into the sheriff's hand to make sure their version found the official ink. But Willa had never been good at being quiet. The morning after the shooting, while Johnny sat in a borrowed room above a livery stable, she walked straight into the sheriff's office. No hat, no escort, no tremble in her step. The men inside, deputies, townsmen, gossips, stopped talking the moment she opened the door. The sunlight caught the dust motes in the air, scattering them like tiny sparks, and for a second no one breathed. She spoke plainly. Told them who Blackwood was, the kind of man who used wealth the way some men used whips. Told them what had happened on that platform, and what Johnny had done only after Blackwood went for his gun. There was no theatrics, no tremor. Her words were clear, clean, the sort of truth that didn't need decoration to be believed. The sheriff listened. He was a practical man with a lawman's sense for when someone was lying, and there was nothing false in what he heard. He asked quiet questions, listened some more, then finally leaned back in his chair and said, "I reckon it was self-defense." Relief didn't show on Willa's face, only gratitude that steady, unflinching kind. Then, true to her nature, she turned to the deputies who'd been whispering in the corner and stared until they couldn't meet her eyes. When she left the office, Johnny was waiting across the street, hat in his hands, coat dusted clean for once. She crossed to him, and in the noise of passing carriages and merchants setting up shop, they didn't need words. One look was enough to tell him that she'd kept him free. They married 2 days later, quietly, with no music, no family, and only two strangers standing witness. A justice of the peace read the vows in a weary voice that sounded like he'd said the same words 100 times before. But for Johnny and Willa, every phrase felt new, sacred even. Practical reasons guided them: to protect her name, to anchor their story legally before anyone could twist it. But underneath, that necessity was the simple truth that they had wanted this for years. Afterward, they stood together outside the courthouse, the Texas sun streaming down so bright it seemed to bleach the color out of the world. Willa held the small bouquet of wildflowers she'd plucked from the scrub just outside town. Johnny looked at her hands, small but sure around those stems, and realized he'd never seen anything so steady. That night, they took a room in a modest hotel where the ceilings were too low, and the floors creaked when the wind blew. Through the window, the stars burned brighter than he remembered, crowding the sky in a spill of cold light. Willa sat by the window, combing the dust from her hair, while Johnny unbuttoned his shirt with slow movements, as though afraid to break the moment by rushing it. "Why didn't you ever tell me before?" Willa asked quietly, her reflection glimmering faintly in the glass. "All those years, all those times we talked about everything under the sun, why not that?" Johnny looked at her, searching for words that didn't sound too small. "You were my best friend," he said after a long pause. "Didn't want to risk losing that. And I wanted the first time I said it to be when it could count for something." She turned, smiling with a hint of sadness. "I'd loved you for years, Johnny. I just thought you'd never see me that way." He crossed the room slowly, the boards creaking under his steps. Reaching up, he tucked one loose strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "I always saw you that way," he murmured. "I just didn't know what to do about it." The silence that followed was its own kind of vow, quiet and complete. They fell asleep later in the narrow bed, her head on his shoulder, the sound of train whistles far away fading into the dark. When dawn came, Willa woke first. The light touched Johnny's face, and for the first time since that day on the platform, his features had softened. Peace, she thought. He looks at peace. They rode home to Elkhart the following week, husband and wife, their horses side by side on the open trail. The land stretched before them, endless and golden, a door finally unlocked. Each mile carried them farther from the noise of Austin and closer to the life they both understood: earth under their boots, honest work, and a sky big enough for every dream they'd been too afraid to name. And for Johnny Dawson, that felt exactly like coming home. Life settled into something that looked, at least from the outside, like peace. The ranch thrived beneath wide skies that changed color hourly, gold and copper at dawn, blue as promised by midday, lavender and fire when the sun fell. The pastures had come back full, the cattle strong. Even the wind carried a new note through the grass, as if the land itself had been waiting for calm. Willa took to the work naturally. She'd always been good with her hands, good with anything that grew. She moved through the rhythm of ranch life like someone counting time to a softer song, feeding, mending, watering, always humming under her breath while she worked. Her presence shifted something in the place. Cats lingered near the porch now. Flowers she hadn't even planted sprouted near the fence lines. It was as though the land was learning her kindness. Johnny rode with her most days. He still woke early, checking fences before the world stirred, but there was a difference in him, an ease that hadn't been there before. The hard lines that used to edge his posture were giving way to something quieter. Every evening after supper, they'd sit on the porch while the light faded, the smell of sweet clover rising from the fields. Sometimes they talked about the future, adding new stock, maybe taking a trip north when the children were older. Other nights they said almost nothing at all. Silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the easy silence of people who didn't need to fill the air to be understood. Kat came by often. She stayed sharp and witty, the kind of woman who seemed built from both grace and flint. She teased Johnny when his boots were left at the door, argue kindly with Willa about whether the hens should be kept closer to the barn, and laugh in that low, musical way that lit the whole house. She was content in the life she'd made, but she kept a watchful eye on the horizon. Peace, she knew, was something that had to be guarded. And she was right. Wade Hayes had not left Elkhart. If anything, he had dug his boots in deeper, in business dealings, in gossip, in all the places where bitterness could grow roots. The loss of Willa's hand had cost him more than pride. Her land had been ripe, finally free of the debts her mother left, and he'd wanted it not only for the acres but for the appearance of victory. When Johnny Dawson returned with Willa married, radiant, unbroken, Hayes's envy turned to something darker. He started with words, muttered things at the saloon, small comments meant to edge under skin and fester. He made a point of being seen, of lifting his glass in mock salute whenever Johnny happened through town. Always smiling, always polite. But cruelty, when it simmers long enough, needs somewhere to boil over. One evening, just before dusk, Kat was in the barn closing up. The horses stirred uneasily, picking up a tension that hadn't yet broken the air. Hayes stepped from the shadows, smile easy, voice low. "Miss Dawson," he said, tipping his hat. "Good-looking evening." Kat's back stiffened. She didn't turn, only said, "You need to head home, Wade, nothing here for you." He took another step. The smell of tobacco clung to him. She could hear the quiet grit of his boots on straw, too close now. What happened next was fast and ugly. Kat fought. That needs to be said plainly. She fought him with elbows, knees, anything she could reach. The lantern light swung wide and shattered across the floor. In the chaos, she caught him across the jaw hard enough to send him stumbling. He cursed, grabbed for her wrist, and she broke free, seizing the broken lantern glass like a weapon. The horse kicked once, startled, and that was enough. Hayes flinched and she ran. She didn't tell Johnny that night. Her hands trembled while she cleaned the blood from a small cut on her arm, but her eyes held steady in the mirror. She told herself she'd handle it. She told herself bringing Johnny into it would only make matters worse. He had finally found peace. She wouldn't be the one to break it. But Johnny found out anyway. People talk even when they don't mean to, and what's said in whispers finds ears it shouldn't. It was the expression on Kat's face that confirmed it for him, the bruised tension around her mouth, the way she avoided his gaze. She didn't have to explain, he understood. He didn't speak for a long time after she told him. Just nodded once, slow, then went out to the porch and stood there until the sun dragged itself up. When he finally saddled his horse, Willa came to the doorway. She didn't ask what he meant to do. He kissed her forehead softly as if to reassure her, then rode out before the day was fully born. 3 days later, they found Wade Hayes outside town, bruised so badly that even the doctor flinched when he saw him. He was barely conscious, and though no one could prove who did it, no one had to. The injuries were deliberate, not fatal, but meant to mark. Message clear as a written confession: leave it be. Hayes healed slow, but when he finally stood on his own again, he didn't linger. His land went up for sale within a week. By the end of the month, the man himself was gone, his pride packed in a trunk along with the few things he cared to carry. And just like that, Elkhart found a new peace. But it was a different kind this time, quieter, edged with something unspoken. The saying started, low and cautious, among the men at the saloon and the traders who passed through with wagon loads of grain. It wasn't the kind of thing people said out loud in front of the Dawsons, but it traveled anyway. Nobody draws on Johnny Dawson. Nobody tests what he loves. And no one in Elkhart was foolish enough to try. 2 years passed, and then 3, the seasons turning over the land with a rhythm both relentless and forgiving. Through harsh winters and long, honey-colored summers, the Dawson Ranch endured. The fences held, the wells stayed sweet, and the herd fattened with spring calves each year. Work never grew lighter, but it wore easier when done by hands that loved what they held. By then, the rhythm of the house had deepened into something solid and tender. Willa and Johnny had 2 children, a boy with his father's serious eyes and his mother's easy smile, and a daughter whose temper could outmatch both parents combined. The boy followed Johnny around the barn, trying to carry things much too heavy for him. The girl ran barefoot after her mother in the garden, hair streaming behind her like flame. Both carried pieces of the land in them, as if the soil itself had chosen to be kind. Kat still came most evenings, her presence a fixture as steady as the sunsets. She never married, though a few had asked. She said she had enough to look after, a brother too brave for his own good, a sister-in-law who reminded her the world still held grace, and 2 children who thought she hung the moon. On an evening in early autumn, the air crisp and threaded with the scent of cut hay, they all sat together on the porch. The light slid long across the fields, turning the grass to rivers of gold. The children played out front, their laughter rising and falling like birds in flight. From the kitchen window came the sound of Kat singing, some old tune she half remembered, off-key but warm. Johnny leaned back in his chair, one boot hooked over the other, Willa's head resting against his shoulder. He watched the way the horizon caught the last light and thought about how much of his life had been spent watching it from horseback, chasing something he couldn't quite name. "Never thought I'd be this lucky," he said quietly. Willa smiled against his arm. "You almost were," he nodded. He could still feel the echo of everything that had come before, the roar of hooves across dusty plains, the burn of Texas sun on his back, the smoke curling lazy from a gun barrel, and Willa's face framed in the morning light at the Austin depot. So many moments that could have gone sideways, so many times he could have turned away. He breathed out slowly. "Sometimes," he said, voice low and thoughtful, "you've got to ride through hell just to find home." She looked up at him. "And did you?" Johnny's mouth lifted into that quiet smile of his. He kissed her temple gently. "I think so." The last of the light slipped below the horizon, leaving the porch wrapped in that calm kind of dusk that belonged to hardworking places. The children came running in, grass-stained and rumpled, breathless with stories about what they'd built in the far field, something about a fort made of sticks. An adventure that ended with laughter and dirt-smudged faces. Willa ushered them inside, her voice soft and mothering, and for a moment Johnny lingered where he was, watching through the open door. The sounds drifted out, the clatter of plates, Kat's teasing laugh, Willa's gentle scolding, the children's bubbling chatter. It was a house alive with living. Johnny turned his eyes back to the land, the sweep of fields glowing faintly under a rising moon. The fences stretched straight, the windmill creaked slow and sure, the prairie stretching beyond everything like an old, enduring promise. He could still feel the road that led him here, the long ride south, the moments carved clean by decision, the pain and fire that had reshaped the life he knew. And somehow, standing there, it all made sense. Every scar, every risk, every long mile between loneliness and love had built this place, this peace. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and the quiet settled, not absence but fullness. Outside, the plains breathed under moonlight, endless and still. And Johnny Dawson, at last, was exactly where he had always been headed.